Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Artifact 4 of Module number 1. Today, we are going to spend some time looking at some sculpture made in Old Kingdom Egypt. And in order to really understand the Egyptian world, we have to understand a little bit about Egyptian geography. Egypt is a country that still exists to this day, but the Egyptian culture, as it existed 5,000 years ago, occupied much more land than does Egypt today. So just to give you an idea, Egypt today is like this little hunk up here, but Egypt during the Egyptian dynasties, particularly the Old Kingdom, began at the Mediterranean and went all the way down the Red Sea to the east, and all the way to the brink of the Sahara Desert on the west. So it's a much bigger area of land. And in order to talk about this, we break Egypt into two distinct parts, lovingly called Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Traditionally, in the West, when we think of the upper part of a map, we think north, just like this map has been oriented for you today. We hold a map with north at the top, and that might be a way to think about upper. But in the instance of the Egyptian world, we think of Egypt as it pertains to the flow of the Nile from south to north. There are mountains in the south, lowlands in the north, and so Upper Egypt here is in the southern part of Egypt. The Nile flows northwards and eventually deposits here in the northern part of the land into the Mediterranean basin. And so Upper Egypt is in the south, Lower Egypt is in the north, although that might seem a little bit counterintuitive to us. One of the things we also need to be mindful of is the importance of the Nile as it pertains to the Egyptian world. And to think about this, I'll say something that you've probably never thought of before, but once you understand it, it becomes one of those things that might pepper into the back of your head. If I were to ask you to name great cities in Europe, whatever they might be, and I'll rattle off somewhere I've been. Let's see, Rome, Florence, Toulouse, Paris, Berlin, Munich, Dublin, London, oh golly, Bruges, Brussels, Ghent. They all have one thing in common, and that is they're all on a river. And this seems silly, but towns spring up on rivers. Rivers allow us water to drink, water for irrigation, water for life. And Egypt itself is kind of barren, 200 meters beyond the Nile. The Nile, quite literally, is the lifeblood of Egypt. Uh, the water used from the Nile floods, depositing silt along the banks. That's the basis for Egyptian farming to this very day. And in the years prior to 3000 BCE, there were two distinct Egyptian cultures, one in the north, and that is Lower Egypt, and one in Upper Egypt, that in the south. And these cultures were distinct. They were different. It would be like North Dakota and South Dakota. They're both Dakotas, I suppose, but they have different governors, they have different state flags, they have different systems of leadership and politics and rule and symbols of rulership. And the same is true in Lower and Upper Egypt. In Lower Egypt, the kind of crown that the rulers wore was this. It was called the wajet, and it kind of looks like an IKEA chair, or better yet, now that I think about it, kind of looks like the boot of Italy, um, with like this little squirrely thingamajig here. It's called the wajet. The symbols that we frequently see in Lower Egyptian depictions of rulership are bees and the papyrus plant, which is very, very important for the Egyptian people. In Upper Egypt, that in the south, The crown that the ruler is shown wearing is this bit here. It's called the neckbet. It kind of looks like a bowling pin. So we have two different parts of Egypt, two distinct cultures that wear two different kinds of crowns. You can think of one being like a derby hat and the other, I don't know, a top hat. In Upper Egypt, the other kinds of symbols that we see are lily flowers and sedges, and I'll show you a sedge in just a little while. Now, there are places in Egypt that you know and some places that you don't. So let's talk about a place that you've likely never heard of as a place, although it was. And that place here is called Rosetta. Rosetta is a place in the northern part of Egypt. It's along one of the banks of the Nile, and it's where one of the branches of the rivers um, uh, empties into the Mediterranean. It's not far from Alexandria. It's maybe, I don't know, like 40 miles away. And in the early part of the 19th century, 1802, if I'm not mistaken, Napoleon and his engineers discovered in Rosetta a large piece of diorite stone, and in it was carved three different languages. Now, the first part of the text was indecipherable. It was hieroglyphics. It was an ancient Greek writing made entirely of pictures, hieroglyphs. The second language in the middle part of it was something called Demotics. Demotics was a kind of Egyptian writing that was primarily used by priests and scholars. It's an Egyptian written form, but it's distinct from hieroglyphics. Um, Somebody once told me, or recently, that no one really speaks or teaches cursive anymore. But when I was in third grade, I think we began learning cursive, and cursive was distinct from the printing that we learned early on because cursive is quicker, right? You don't lift your pencil up for every new character. You just kind of let it flow along. This is a kind of cursive for Egyptian scribes and priests. It allows them to write quicker. Underneath that was ancient Greek. Ancient Greek can still be read today. So interestingly, when scholars began looking at this, they realized that the text here, which was Greek and they could read it, and the text here, which was demonic, which they had a hard time reading, but believed that it was the same. Um, and they believed it was the same because of the appearance here of the name Ptolemy. Ptolemy was the name of an Egyptian ruler, and so his name appeared there. It appeared over here, and interestingly, it appeared up top as well. And so, quite suddenly, scholars believed that this object contained the same three texts in three different written languages: hieroglyphics up top, Demotics in the middle, and ancient Greek, which they could read. All of a sudden now, they believed that they had the tools to decipher, learn, and read ancient hieroglyphics, which no one had been able to do yet. And so in many ways, the Rosetta Stone provided the clues needed for Egyptologists to learn how to read the ancient Egyptian language. It's currently now in the British Museum behind glass. So this is what it looks like today. And it's not a coincidence that if you think about language acquisition software, the Rosetta Stone is perhaps the most famous because the Rosetta Stone was the Rosetta Stone for ancient Egyptian language. It's not surprising that many Egyptian works of art are filled and covered with various kinds of writings. And one of the most famous works of the pre-dynastic period is that of the palette of Narmer. This is a slate tablet. It's about 2 feet tall, and it has both a front and a back side. We'll talk about them in turn. We'll call this one the front for no discernible reason, and we'll talk about this one as the back. And there's some things going on here that we saw a little bit of with Sumerian art. We talked about it very quickly, but if you remember Sumerian art, I showed you something like this, the standard of Ur. And I said, remember that this is a standard. It provides us an opportunity to do more than one narrative on a work of art. And interestingly, the palette of Narmer has the same thing. We can think of this top part here being a kind of register, this one here, and that one there. So we'll spend some time looking at the top one, and we'll look at it sort of bit by bit. On the upper part of this, we have a large glyph here in the middle. That glyph we call a serif, and a serif is kind of a place of importance in Egyptian documents where a person's name is often placed. So when I was a wee little tyke and we were learning to write our names on papers, we always wrote our name in the upper right-hand corner of the sheet of paper. And what this meant is that if you were given a piece of paper from my second grade class in 1982, and at the top of that you saw the name Jenny Peterson, which was the girl I had the biggest crush on, you would probably know that Jenny Peterson wasn't the name of a grocery store, but the name of a person, because that was the place where people wrote their names. This was the place where people's names went. It's how we know who this guy is. His name is comprised of 2 different glyphs. Catfish here, you can sort of make out his little whiskers, and this right there is a chisel. Those 2 glyphs put together, the catfish and the chisel, equal the name Narmer. And you might be thinking, well, isn't his name Catfish Chisel Man? And the answer is no. Just like my name is not Bryan. Think of this as a character in a name. Catfish, Chisel. This could be B, and that could be R. Those 2 symbols together equal Narmer. So up there, we have the catfish and the chisel. Underneath or to the side of that, both here on the left and on the right, we have the bull-headed Egyptian god of Hathor. Hathor was often considered to be the mother of the Egyptian pharaohs, who styled himself as like the son of the gods. We'll have to do a little bit of work talking about pharaohs, but for the time being, know that pharaohs are not like you or I. Pharaohs are children of the gods. They're not exactly humans. They're something a bit different. And so this placement of Hathor on this suggests that. Pharaohs aren't really people. They're closer to gods than humans, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that in a second. If we look at the middle part of the composition, you can see Narmer here. And please note that Narmer is wearing the neckbed, the fancy bowling pin crown of Upper Northern Egypt. And if we think about Narmer, his body has been shown in the Naram Sin sense of the word. His lower body is in profile, his upper body is frontal, his head is in profile. And look, he's got this really nice chin strap beard. And behind him is his attendant. And you can see right here, right where my cursor is, there's another glyph that identifies this person. Now we have something going on here that you've seen before, the idea of hieratic scaling. Narmer is shown bigger than his servant here who's behind him, but he's also closer to us. There's a couple of different ways that art makers can render distance and depth on a flat object. One is ground line and the other is size. So Narmer here is closer to us because his ground line is lower. He's further away because his ground line is higher. And we also get an idea of scale because of, or the distance because of the scale, right? Narmer's closer to us, so of course he's bigger. His attendant is further away from us, so of course he's smaller. But these two people, Narmer and this guy, occupy the same ground line. And still, Narmer is bigger, and he's bigger for a very simple reason. He's more important. And if we look what Narmer's going to do, Narmer is about to bash this guy's brain in. He's quite literally grabbing him by the hair, and he's got the beat down stick here. And on some level, what he's about to do is ask this man's brains to be disassociated from his skull. And so this is Narmer in the role of conquering victor. Kings often like to be shown this way. I mean, this is a good example of a gigantic site of a building from Luxor, and the same thing is happening. And this is from later. This is from 2100 BCE, and this would have been buried. So the person who made this never saw that. It's just the ways in which leaders were often rendered. And so Narmer, bigger than the sniveling idiot he's about to crush. And again, here's his attendant. His attendant is holding Narmer's shoes and carrying what looks to be a jar of some kind. And we will see this glyph come back to us again. Underneath Narmer, you can see a couple of people who he has already conquered, right? This is the depiction of some defeated foes. And in some way, it might remind you a little bit of the way we saw the defeated foes shown with the stele of Naram Sin there. So this is the front side of this object. This is the backside. And in the backside, some interesting things are happening. And when we view the front and the backside together, we will be able to discern a very specific meaning for this object, despite the fact that its function is very everyday. So let's look at the backside. Here it is. We again see the same glyphs, the same serif that we saw before, our catfish and our chisel, surrounded by Hathor. And in the main part of the composition here, you can see something interesting. To begin with, we have Narmer again, and Narmer, let me go back, Narmer is wearing the IKEA chair crown of Lower Egypt. So over here, he's wearing the crown of Upper Egypt. And over here, he's wearing the crown of Lower Egypt. And so in some ways, what this object is speaking to is the unification of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. It would be as if I ran for governor of West Virginia, and after a successful 8-year term as governor of that state, me and my roving West Virginia army went to other Virginia and said, "Hi, I'm Governor Brian. I brought my army with you. It's time to be just Virginia." And so that's what this is talking about. You can see we have Narmer wearing this hat, the hat of the other crown of Egypt. Over here again is his attendant, holding his sandals and carrying that pot of goodness. I don't know what it is, maybe oil or water, Gatorade or something. And there's his name. And as we look around it, just in case you didn't know who that was, there it is, catfish and chisel. And here are his standard bearers. A standard is a kind of flag. And so again, here's Narmer. He's the starting center on our basketball team. Here's our power forward, and here are our guards, right? They're small, not as important as the king, who's shown enormous. And over here, here are the bad guys. And I ask you, how is their Wednesday? And their Wednesday isn't so good. How do we know? Because their heads have been cut off and placed between their legs. The message is clear, my friends. Do not mess with Narmer. It's only in the middle part of the backside of this object where we really get to the function of this object, or the practical function. There's another function that we've already mentioned, right? This object commemorates the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. That's one function. But palettes like this usually have another kind of function. It's a makeup tray. Now, I'm saying that with 5% snark, but wait for it. It's a makeup tray. Egyptians wore makeup. They wore eye makeup to shield their eyes from the bright, glaring sun. And I know you think it's sunny in Louisiana. It's really sunny in Egypt. Like there's sand and there's water, both of which glare a lot. And so Egyptians wore eye makeup as a way of protecting their eyes from that sun. It's not that dissimilar from what baseball players wear under their eyes. That was mixed up, placed in this little divot here, and then applied when needed. So it's a makeup tray. But to be honest, it's a really fancy makeup tray. It's not just any makeup tray, it's a really cool one. And this one, the little divot for the makeup, is created through the intermingling, intertwined necks of these long-necked uh, mythological beasties who are being controlled very scarily by men with robes. In some ways, this visual motif is not an Egyptian one. It comes from ancient Sumeria. And here you can see that same idea. I'll repeat something you've heard before. It doesn't mean that whoever made the palette of Narmer saw this. They didn't. This is one little thing. It just shows that this was a relatively common artistic motif. And underneath all of this, we have Hathor, right? Hathor, both here and there. Hathor, the parent of Narmer, is shown here knocking over a bad guy, and this is kind of a representation of a city. So the palette of Narmer does two things. One, it has a practical function, right? It was a makeup tray. But it does something far more important. It speaks to the unification of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And with this person around the year 3000 BCE, we change from Egypt being a divided place to being a unified place. So everything in Egypt prior to 3000 BCE is considered pre-dynastic, before the dynasties. And everything after that, such as Khafre here, will be Old Kingdom or New Kingdom. And so this is pre-dynastic. And with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, we have the beginning of Dynasty 1, and then Egypt becomes a different thing altogether. Incidentally, when you go to museums in Egypt or in Europe, and you should, you will see that palettes like this exist all over the place. This is a cool one I found recently in London called the Hunter's Palette. And please note, it's got the same kind of shape, doesn't it? But it still has that divot for our eye spackle. So that's the beginning of Egyptian art. I thought I might show you a couple of cool statues that speak to some other kinds of things. It'll let us talk about the way in which the human body gets rendered in different kinds of sculpture. And so what you're looking at here is the Ka statue of Khafre. Ka is spelled Ka, and Ka is the Egyptian word for spirit or soul. In the Egyptian idea, Your spirit, when you died, temporarily leaves your body while your body is being mummified. But your spirit needs to be rejoined with your body. And so what happened was Ka statues were made for your spirit to reside in during the moment between your death and when your body is brought to the burial structure when you're after you've been mummified. So these were remarkably important objects. Now, clearly, a Ka statue would change on the basis of who it was being made for. A pharaoh's Ka statue would look different than an art history professor's Ka statue. But the best of those that survive are from pharaohs, and they survive for two reasons. One, they were buried for a really long time. And secondly, they were made for the hardest and the most durable materials. This object is made from diorite. And diorite might not be a, a material that you're familiar with, but diorite is an 8.4 on the Mohs scale. Here's what you should know. A diamond is a 10. 8.4 is really, really, really hard. So the harder something is, the longer it's going to last, the more difficult it is to carve, um, and the more valuable it is. I mean, there's a reason why diamonds are expensive, and part of it's the permanence. Like, I don't know what the Earth is going to look like 5,000 years from now, but the diamond on my wife's hand is going to look probably exactly what it looks like now. And so diorite was one of those things. There's something else at play here that we'll talk about, and that is bilateral symmetry. And what I mean to suggest by this is that the left and right sides of the object look similar. Now, this might not, you might not believe this because you look at his left hand and it's open and his right fist is clenched. But if you were to look at the object here on the left hand side, close your eyes, everyone, close your eyes, and now look at this one. I think you would agree they look more or less the same. And all I've really done is some crazy Photoshop magic and put this over top here, right? But more or less, the left and right kind of look the same. And so this idea is very much a part of bilateral symmetry, and the Egyptians are very much in favor of this. It seems to make the object look as if it's still. And you might think, Brian, of course it's still. It's a stone statue. But I will show you objects that are going to be made out of stone that are not going to look still. They will look as if they are meant to move, but this is not that object. It is still, it is static, it is permanent, it's never going to move. And if we were to think about his body, I think we could agree that there is a sense of perfection about it. When we talked about the Venus of Willendorf, I mentioned to you that she's been abstracted in some ways. And really, there are three ways, three traditional ways to render the human body. One is the naturalistic version, and that's the body exactly as it looks like, right? So I'm 6'1" and 175 pounds. The naturalistic rendering of my body would be 6'1" and 175 pounds. An abstract version of my body would be me breaking my body down into the most recognizable parts. So, for example, if I were to draw a stick figure, you would identify it as a body, even though it doesn't look anything like a human body. But there's enough there to get you to where I want you to go. Body. The other way is the idealized form. It's our bodies not as they are, but maybe as we wish they were. So in Artifact 1, we talked about my relationship with as a patron with an art maker. And I want you to make me not as I am, but as I wish I were. So Not 6'1", 6'3", not 175, 210, 2% body fat, upper lip, and big blue eyes. That's the idealized version of Brian that will never be, but that's the version we have of Khafre here. Now, Khafre has been shown with these rounded shoulders, nice biceps, good pectoralis muscles, and I would ask you, how many days a week do you think Khafre works out? Knowing that Khafre doesn't really have a day job. Like, Khafre doesn't work out. Khafre's a pharaoh. Khafre wants grapes. He snaps his fingers. People want some grapes. Bring him grapes. He's a little hot. Please come fan me. Do you think Khafre ever laid brick? Khafre ever ran cross country? No, Khafre doesn't do anything. But Khafre is a pharaoh. There's this idea that he be represented in an idealized, godlike way, and that's what we have here. He's wearing things traditionally assigned to Egyptian pharaohs. He has the false beard here hanging around his chin, and this linen headdress around his head and falling upon his shoulders, and the linen kilt around his waist. These are the symbols of Egyptian rulership. And a little cool picture here is he's being hugged in the back by Horus, which I love. Horus is an Egyptian god. The Egyptians, just like the Sumerians and the Akkadians, are a polytheistic culture. They have a god for everything you can imagine. They have a god for the sky, the moon, the river, the sun, for ham sandwiches, for the Nile. They have a god for Tuesday and for the underworld. Horus is one of the gods of the underworld. And so here he is in a structure that's meant as a burial, made for a burial structure, here giving Khafre his cute hug. Now, I mentioned to you his body has been idealized, and I'll show you a work of art from kind of my wheelhouse, American art, of George Washington. Now, this was commissioned for the United States Capitol in 1840 and was completed by an American-born but Italian trained sculptor named Horatio Greeno. And here's George, nude to the waist, wearing a toga. And I give you the upper body and midsection of a 70-year-old man. And you're like, wow. Go get it, George. This is not what my grandpa looked like, but this was the ways in which pharaohs were shown, this idealized perfect body, and it's the way in which George Washington was shown, which is why this object was made fun of, was eventually removed from the Capitol building, put outside where it was defaced by pigeons for 100 years, and it's now in the basement at the Smithsonian. This is the rendering of a pharaoh. And here is, for lack of a better phrase, his son. Khafre is the dad, Mancari as his son, and this is him standing with his wife, whose name I can neither pronounce or actually spell, which is why I've always referred to this as Mancari and his wife. Khafre is about 5'9". He's standing. If he were to stand up, no doubt he would be well over 6 feet. This is a little bit smaller, and it's made not out of diorite, but out of sandstone. Sandstone is infinitely softer to carve. I think sandstone's like a 6.2 on the Mohs scale, so it's much softer by about a factor of 20, but still a hard stone. And Mancari, like Khafre, has been shown with an idealized body. He's been shown with the false beard, the headdress around his head and shoulders, the kilt, and there's still that sense of left and right being the same, particularly in the upper body, if not in the legs. One leg is coming forward, one leg is coming backwards, or like slightly recessed. And I often like to think about this painting. Who do you think loves who more? because he's standing there, arms by his side, and she's kind of standing there with her arms around him, and he doesn't even seem to know that she's there. Again, this is a Ka statue, a statue made for a burial structure so that the spirit could find the body once it's returned to the mortuary. Two pharaohs, two idealized bodies, and now I give you our seated scribe. Now, I don't want to make fun of our seated scribe too much. The seated scribe is a remarkably well-to-do member of Egyptian society. He can read, he can write. This is an important guy. But let's be honest, he's been shown like he's an art history professor. To say nothing of the fact that he's also been made out of something softer. We've gone from diorite and sandstone for our two pharaohs to limestone, which is much, much softer. And so he's been shown much more realistic. As a person, there's not an obligation to show him as if he were a god, because he's not. He's an art history professor, and so you can show him as the flabby mess that he was because there's no need to show him like a god. He's also much, much smaller. When we think about these objects, right, on the computer screen right now, they look like they're the same size. Heck, Khafre looks like he's the same size. But as you know, I like to show picture of students. And so here's Nina with the seated scribe, and his Ka statue is practically like I don't know, a Cabbage Patch Kid or something. He's much, much smaller. So if you are a pharaoh, you're made out of something enormously hard like diorite. Your body has been shown like it's perfect, and it's life size, if not more so. And in contrast to that, a commoner, it's not even fair to call him a commoner, someone who was not a pharaoh would have been made out of something much softer, shown much more naturalistically, and shown much smaller. The seated scribe is still a member of the elite. So too is the governor. But the materials used for those people are much, much different, right? This guy's made out of wood. That he survives is kind of a miracle and is due primarily to the dry environment in Egypt. Everyday people like art history professors, their Ka statue wouldn't have been made out of wood. It wouldn't have been made out of sandstone or limestone. It would have been made out of, mud brick or something much more impermanent. And I sort of have this running joke in the classes I teach that if Dr. Geiss is the president, he would be made out of diorite. As an associate dean, I might be made out of wood. The graduate students who might teach classes in engineering, they'd be made out of cardboard or graham crackers or marshmallow fluff or something. The more important you were, the harder your object. The more important you were, the bigger it would be. The more important you were, the more perfect your body. And as you went away from Ka statue of a pharaoh to Ka statue of Egyptian beer brewer, your Ka statue, which would do the same kind of work, would look very, very different. In this artifact, what we looked at primarily was burial objects. All of these were found in burial settings. It's one of the reasons why they survived. They're buried in the desert for 4,000 years or more. But they all served a very similar function. In our next artifact, we'll shift our focus from sculpture in burial settings to the architecture of the burial settings. And in a subsequent artifact, we'll also look at the kinds of things that happened in New Kingdom Egypt, because the things we've looked at here were all from the Old Kingdom. But a big change is happening when we move from the polytheistic Old Kingdom to the monotheistic New Kingdom, and that is coming up soon.